we should start today, Module 6 of our very exciting course on Caribbean society, economy, and ecology. Today is quite exciting because we have with us Minister Marsha Caddle, Minister of Finance from Barbados. And today we're going to have a presentation from her on the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Plan. Now, I'm sure our participants know a new Barbadian government came into office in May 2018, and they inherited quite an interesting situation from the previous government fiscally. They had a number of challenges in terms of public debt, but also internal reserves. You can imagine Barbados like any of our individual households, and you could imagine a situation where your household owed a lot of money, but had very little savings because of previous management practices. So I think today we're going to have a presentation from her, followed by a question and answer, followed by a facilitated question period, and then some questions from the rest of the participants. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Minister Caddle. Thank you so much for being here, and we're looking forward to your presentation. So turning it over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Is everyone hearing me all right?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Alexander, and thanks, Peggy and Roberta and the organizers of the course. It's very exciting to be able to discuss these issues in a way that we don't normally get to discuss them, which is with a view specifically towards social justice for Caribbean people. So this is a very exciting opportunity for me. Now, I want in my presentation to do about 4 things. One is just to give an overview of the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Plan. The plan, as the name says, prioritizes recovery, but also transformation. So it is, I often find it difficult to go into all of the different parts of the plan, but I just want to give participants an idea of, in particular on the adjustment side, what we were trying to accomplish. And then I believe that some of the questions that Alexander poses and that you have will also get us to the transformation side. So I wanted to give an overview to say what we were trying to achieve. Then I want to look at how we have attempted to address social justice in the plan, not just through social measures, but also using the economic tools that we have available to be able to do that. I want then to have a quick discussion about our plans for growth. And I think that as part of our growth plan, we are also trying to achieve growth with social justice, inclusive growth, equitable growth. And so I want to be able to say a little bit about that. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about and really sometimes what is the technical nature of these adjustment programs, and to start to explore with the participants perhaps what are some of the things we might do to be able to address or remove the cyclical nature of some of the work that we do and some of the situations in which we find ourselves where we are either in a period of growth, which we haven't been for some time, but some of our economies are getting there, or we are in a period of adjustment. But inevitably, we seem to be coming back around to a period of adjustment and why that is and what we might be able to do. So let me start by looking at what we were trying to achieve with the BIRD plan. Now, we had a decade in Barbados from 2008 to 2018, which really was a challenge for the country in terms of economic development and social progress. And it was characterized by the absence of growth. We had very large and widening fiscal deficits. We had an increase in our debt to levels that were extremely unsustainable. In fact, our debt service as a percentage of revenue in 2017-18, that financial year, was 192%. And so it just tells you that it simply was not possible for us to continue servicing our debt, we really had no fiscal space to invest in anything at all, to make very critical social investments, very critical infrastructure investments. There was no space. We were the third highest indebted country in the world. And so one of the things that the BERT program had to address was those unsustainable debt levels. We also, I would say, had what we term as institutional decay. So several of the institutions that Barbadians had come to rely on, whether it was enterprises or businesses or companies that deliver social services, or even social institutions, social capital institutions like community-based organizations and churches and so on. I think that because of the absence of strong governance, because of the weakness of governance, there was just a decline in public confidence in institutions, the fact that institutions were not delivering, the fact that there was not things like sanitation, garbage collection, access to water, all of the basic services that Barbadians had become used to in the post-independence period had become compromised. At that time, we also lost access to international capital markets. So we had 22 downgrades by rating agencies. And at the same time, our reserves fell from almost $2 billion Barbados to $400 million. And there's a bit of a debate on what is the level of reserves that matter. But that 400 million in May 2018 was about 5 weeks of import cover. And I think many of us understand that if you have a fixed exchange rate of 2 to 1 like Barbados does, your reserves actually back that exchange rate. Your reserves mean that you can keep that rate fixed because you're not going to get to a point where there's kind of underground or black market trading of the dollar because people are worried about its stability. So the international benchmark that we try to hold fast to is 12 weeks. And in fact, we are in the middle of a conversation globally now about whether that benchmark remains sustainable given some of the shocks that we can expect because of the climate crisis and so on. And the discussion is whether that should actually be 20 weeks. But that's where we were in May 2018 at 5 weeks of import cover and falling. And in fact, what happened was that if we had a payment, a principal payment that was due in June of 2018. And if we had made that, we would have lost half of that import cover. So that would have taken us down to 200 million. So our government came to service at the end of May 2018. And we didn't have any time. As I just mentioned, we had this principal payment due in June, and we really had a really, really critical situation in terms of the economic and social development of the country that we had to address right away. And so we came up with the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Plan. And that really was about, it's a medium-term strategy, so focused on about 3 years in the first instance. That is about restoring macroeconomic stability and being able to achieve sustainable and inclusive growth. But we had first to lay out the path for a very strong fiscal adjustment, so that the fiscal adjustment that we had to achieve was about 2.5% of GDP. So Barbados' GDP is about $10 billion. And we came up with this plan that we would eventually present to the International Monetary Fund to be able to get their support as part of an extended fund facility program for 48 months. And I just want to say quickly what were some of what we call the anchors of the program. So what were the things that we had to do? We set a target of a fiscal surplus of 6%. So your primary fiscal balance just to say quickly, for those who may not have this top of mind, your primary fiscal balance is excluding your interest payments, your revenue minus expenditure. It's really that simple. So it was really that having run these deficits year after year, we were now committing, in the first year of the BERT plan, we committed to 3.5% of GDP surplus. So not only did we have to remove the deficit, but then we had to have a surplus. But then the following 3 years, the program commits to a 6.5% surplus. In any adjustment program, that is extremely ambitious. And obviously, you only have your revenue and expenditure to as your tools, right? As your instruments that can affect that surplus. So really, you are increasing revenue and you're cutting expenditure. That's all you have at your disposal, and you're increasing revenue. And we all know it very well, either by your regular taxes or by your user fees. So the other main anchor of the program had to do with our debt to GDP. So the program targeted a debt to GDP ratio of 60% by the year 2033. But when it came to debt, we had a much more immediate problem. And so what we did was we suspended debt payments. So we announced a domestic debt restructuring. And for Barbados, our domestic debt was almost 80% of total debt. And the rest was foreign. So we announced a domestic debt restructuring, but we also announced an external debt restructuring, which was quite ambitious, but we were able to quite successfully achieve both. Now, I want to come next to the second part of what I want to talk about, which is the social justice measures. And one of the things that we did with our adjustment program, which is probably never done, is we sought to make some upfront investments, social investments, knowing that we would be going into this fund program and that it would be difficult, especially at the level of the household. So the first thing we did was we reinstituted free tertiary education for all Barbadians. So not just at the University of the West Indies, but at TechVoc institutions and so on, like Community College, SJP at Samuel Jackman Preston Institute, and others. And the reason we did that was that we found that the removal of free tertiary education had this effect where it had really put a strain on households, and it had affected families were using some of these resources to help fund access to tertiary education for, some grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And so we found that, the dependency ratio for individuals who were above a certain age, 60, 65, was really increasing. And, we thought it was really not a sustainable situation. Barbadians had really prioritized access, that there was plunge in tertiary education. And we thought that Barbados had been built on a model of access to education, to be able to have access to income. And that was something that was important to us to be able to continue to support. So we introduced that measure even before we went to the fund, because we said that we were not going to defend that to the fund. We wanted that when the fund came to speak with us, that was already a measure we had introduced. Similarly, we increased the amount of expenditure on for welfare. So what we call welfare, the welfare department, which is the agency that does in-kind cash transfers to families who are in need. And for that financial year, in that first budget, we increased that vote by 5 million, because we expected that there would be, that households would find it challenging in the midst of the adjustment. And so we introduced some social expenditure measures early on, and then went to engage with the IMF and sign the EFF program, because we were going to have, we had decided that we were ring fencing health and education. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting one of the health investments, which is that we also put some resources into expanding healthcare, so strengthening polyclinics, strengthening the accident and emergency department of the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, and so on. We took a decision as part of the EFF program that we were ring fencing health and education, so that there would not be any capital or recurrent cuts in those sectors. And that was one of our strategies for trying to avoid a real decline on the well-being side for Barbadians. Now, the size of the adjustment that we had to make, and this is one of the reasons that we say that this adjustment has been one of the most shared that you will ever see, because the recommendations that had been coming from all directions of how we could cut expenditure was an extreme cut in the wage bill. Now, like most Caribbean countries like Barbados, we have the public sector employs a lot of people. And so in the last administration, a lot of the recommendations, a lot of what was said was that, oh, well, you would have to cut jobs. And because of the size of the expenditure, really, if we had to cut, use only the wage bill to address the expenditure that we needed to cut, we would have had to get rid of almost the entire public service. And it sounds absurd, but that's the size of the adjustment that we needed to make. Instead, we said, and we said this from way before we entered into the fund program, that we are no longer entering into the kind of adjustment where labor is on the front line and where the only economic strategy you can have is to just cut jobs. So what we did was we entered an exercise with the public where we put online a survey saying to people, well, look across government, both central government, all of the state-owned enterprises, departments, agencies, and tell us what you think is a service that needs to be delivered by government, absolutely needs to be delivered by government. So we had this kind of four-part kind of multiple choice, so that it absolutely needs to be delivered. It would be nice to have delivered, but it's not absolutely necessary. Needs to be delivered by government, or can best be delivered elsewhere. And so we put this survey online. We had a tremendous response to it. And people were able to tell us, we feel as Barbadians that if there were to be cuts in terms of the delivery of these services or by these agencies, that is something we could live with. And so we made we did the retrenchments, the separations from the public service on the basis of that feedback. Now, remember, we're looking at having to cut probably over 10,000 jobs if we were only putting the adjustment on labor. We ended up seeing the retrenchment of 1,000 workers, and we were adamant that we were not going far past 1,000. And instead, we sought to make the adjustment in other ways. One of those ways was the debt restructuring. And it meant that capital, really, the financial system, would have been the ones really taking the blow for the adjustment that we had to do to get rid of the deficit. And the other way that we shared that burden is by introducing revenues to a sector that would not affect Barbadians as much, which is the tourism sector. And there were some kind of controversial changes that we made, but we introduced, for example, a room levy and other charges that were associated with travel, because we also thought that along with labor and capital, those who were visiting and kind of enjoying the country and staying here for a while should also be sharing in that adjustment, because what we were attempting to do was something that would really benefit the visitor community as well. So that was another way we sought to kind of ease the adjustment burden on regular people and regular Barbadians. And those are some of the social measures, but I also want to talk a little bit about what we've tried to do since that initial adjustment period with some of our other revenue measures. Now, we've kind of developed an economic and a social strategy that is shifting where we raise taxes. And we want to incentivize jobs and growth and productivity and how people use land and savings. And so what we did was we reduced the number of exemptions on VAT while we kept VAT off essential goods. We also raised land taxes on the most expensive homes while we kept land taxes the same for about 80% of Barbadians. And we increased corporation taxes on only the biggest companies while we were able to lower the rates on other companies to become the lowest OECD compliant tax jurisdiction in the world. We did those things to allow us to be able to reduce income taxes. Now, income tax obviously is a tax on jobs and it's a tax on work. And we don't want to tax jobs and work because we want people to find jobs, we want people to work. So what we did was we lowered income tax, starting with increasing the lowest band. This is the only example I will give because I don't want to make this too technical, but I just want to give an example. Previously, you would get a reverse tax credit, which means a repayment from the government if you fell below $18,000 in your annual income. We expanded that to $25,000, so that understanding that the purchasing power of the dollar had fallen, and so people weren't able to get as much for the dollar now as they were before, and so we expanded that to 25,000. And so all throughout every band, we were able to lower the income tax rate because we felt that that was important to be able to make it easier for people to have disposable income to spend on the things that they value. The other thing that we were able to do through the BERT program is because you're not able to run arrears as a government while you're in an IMF program. Now, just to give you an idea, under the previous decade, 08 to 2018, the 176% debt to GDP ratio that we had run up included almost 2 billion of arrears, which meant that government wasn't paying its bills. Government was not giving VAT refunds, it wasn't giving corporation tax refunds. It had a real depressing effect, not just on large companies, but also on smaller companies, also on the SME sector, because I think many of us understand that the smaller you are as a business, the more you rely on those refunds to be able to reinvest in your business. So the other thing we were able to do using the BERT program, so using the fact that we had to make these adjustments, is we were able to give VAT and corporation tax refunds to individuals, to households, to companies, to be able to drive economic activity, but also to, again, allow people to have disposable income to spend on the things that they value. So those are just some of the examples of what I call the social justice measures that are part of the BERT plan. And it was a way that we used an adjustment program to very carefully target how we would give individuals and households access to income, even in the midst of an adjustment. So quickly, I want to come to what we have established as a growth plan. And if you look at the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation document, it gives an idea of how we are trying to set the country up for growth. I say set the country up for growth because it is almost unheard of, again, to be able to achieve growth in the midst of an adjustment. Adjustments are about contraction. And you find that it is a very rare that a country, I mean, let me put it this way. You're doing well if you're able to remain steady so that you don't have a contraction in the economy during an adjustment program. But what we thought it was important to be able to do was to help set the platform for growth. And even though we had to limit capital expenditure under the program, we firmly believe that governance is about choices. And so a big part of what we had to do was to realize efficiency gains in our expenditure. That would mean that we could spend more on the things that are important. Now, when we came to service as a government, we had some what we call mission critical expenditures that had to do with essentially with service delivery. One of those was getting buses back on the road for the public transport system. Another of those was making sure there were garbage trucks to pick up garbage because we were having a sanitation and a public health crisis. And two others had to do with cleaning up the South Coast sewage system. So we literally had sewage on the streets in the couple years before 2018. And also fixing our roads. So some of the critical infrastructure that would improve the investment climate, but also, of course, improve people's day-to-day lives. So one of the obvious pillars for growth had to do with making very critical expenditures in some key infrastructure and key services that would allow people to simply live easier lives and be able to move around and have confidence that the jurisdiction in which they're investing is prioritizing the right things. But the other thing we were able to do was to really look at efficiency across the board in state-owned enterprises. And that's something that the fund program allowed us to do, which is we didn't have a lot of fiscal space because we had limited expenditure. So the only way we could create that space was to cut the fat, limit wastage, spending, overspending on large contracts, addressing issues of corruption and inappropriate procurement practice. And these kinds of measures got us savings that meant that we could reinvest those savings in things that mattered to Barbadians. Quickly though, I want to say that our growth plan, we call it a 7-point plan, that I can't get into all of it in this short presentation, but I wanted to highlight a few things. The first point of that 7-point plan is investment in health and education. And so our growth plan acknowledges that the way that you make sure that people are able to participate in any growth that you're targeting is to make sure that they are healthy, that they don't have to spend their income on access to health services and education, that they have enough skills and enough of the right skills to participate in a new economy. And so this continues to be a part of our recovery, but also of our transformation to get the country ready for a period of inclusive growth. Another part of the plan has to do with our engagement as part of CARICOM. And we realize that a lot of what we target, for example, agriculture and food security, and how we're able to use our natural environment to provide for our people, we can't do some of these things alone. Barbados has a land and space challenge. While we are employing new agricultural methods that don't call for lots of land, we think it's very important to be able to partner with our CARICOM neighbors and others in the wider Latin American and Caribbean region to have a larger market. Because the growth that we need to see, if our only market is confined to the borders of Barbados, we realize that that's not going to give people their best chance at success. especially in export markets. So engagement with CARICOM, integration into CARICOM, but also integration into new markets, like on the African continent. That's a very important part of our plan as well. And finally, I want to say a little bit about what I see as some of our constraints. And I think that those hopefully came out in what I've just presented. And it's that, we have, as small Caribbean economies, this challenge where, as part of the international financial architecture, there's certain things on which we are takers. And so while we were very clear with the fund on what we were not willing to compromise, and where there was space, the truth is that if we keep finding ourselves in a model where we are borrowing in a way that's not the most productive, or we are borrowing for infrastructure and other things that are vulnerable to the climate crisis and so on, we will continue to find ourselves in this economic cycle where we have this boom and bust periods that we're not prepared for. Now, the growth model that I just shared a little bit with you about really attempts to be counter-cyclical in its approach, which is you make the most of your investment in people and in infrastructure and in things that are fundamental to your well-being when it is least convenient to do so. So you actually need, in periods of adjustment, to invest in people in particular, so that when you come to a period of growth, your people, your institutions are best placed to be able to participate in that growth. So this BERT plan is perhaps one of the first where Barbados is introducing a counter-cyclical approach to its economics and a counter-cyclical economic model, because what we've done in the past is we've failed to invest in people when we've had to bring about an adjustment. And then because of that, another adjustment quickly follows. So I think I wanted to say a bit about what I see as constraints, because I think that for our discussion in this module and this course, we have to be a bit frank and open about what are our real tools and what are our real entry points for change, today on the ground. And as someone who's interested in social justice, I think that has been the challenge for me as a minister with responsibility for economic affairs and investment, that these are the tools at our disposal, and how can we best use them to be able to see the social justice, and the kinds of social justice that we know we owe to Caribbean people. So I will stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Wow, great. Thank you so much, Minister Caddle, for that really comprehensive presentation. Very economics heavy. I can tell that you are certainly an economist. And as I mentioned to you privately earlier, I don't think any of us envy your position as a Minister of Finance with a Prime Minister who herself is quite steeped in economics. Thank you so much for first giving us the context, the situation that Barbados found itself in 2 years ago, the difficulty of that situation, but then as well, some of the social safety nets that you're building into the program, and finally ending with the idea of countering the cycle. I kind of wanted to start by, excuse me, start at the end, this idea of countering the cycle, because you're articulating how the BERT is very different from other structural adjustment programs. So I was wondering, if you could maybe briefly describe what a traditional structural adjustment program looks like, and then emphasize these differences that you have in the BERT. what does the IMF typically come in and do? But also, how were you able to convince the IMF that you should be doing something different by protecting healthcare and education?
Well, I think one, and not to be an advocate of the fund, but I think that this generation of fund programs is a little different from what we saw in the late 80s and early 90s. I won't say that the fund has completely changed its disposition, but the first thing we did was we wrote the BERT plan first, from top to bottom. And that meant that we were able to forecast and to show the numbers for the kinds of, so the reduction in the deficit, the reduction in the debt, the strengthening of the primary balance, all of those things we had figured out, and we had figured out how we could do that while managing to ring fence key social sectors. So the fact that we did that, there were first of all, we made our key investments in education and social protection that were non-negotiable before we went to the fund. But then when we went to the fund, we went with a plan that was fully baked already, asking them to endorse it. And that gave us the flexibility to target the things that were important to us, while showing them that we could have this adjustment while prioritizing those things. So I think that was important to be able to do, and I think that countries need to, if they have to go to international financial institutions to have these kinds of programs endorsed, as much work as you can do up front, to be able to show that you understand what needs to be done, that is important. So the convincing came from the fact that our numbers spoke for themselves, really, that we came with a program that had social investment built in already, while giving us the surplus that we needed. And as I said, a lot of that came from the fact that we were able to really make some efficiency gains in our operations, and free up some fiscal space in that way.
Okay, I think that's a really great take home, that in this case you kind of went with your own plan instead of having a plan kind of forced on you. But it's also interesting that you acknowledge that there has been a slight shift, because before, I think, everything would be cut: healthcare, education, etc.
Yeah. So I think I neglected to answer the first part of your question, which is what did adjustment programs typically look like? And you're right. They normally, the fund would traditionally say, okay, this is the number you need to meet, and because it's probably not the best word to use, but because it's easiest to cut the wage bill, that's where countries would often start. In our case, our wage bill was actually not as large as our transfers to state-owned enterprises. So we had very, very high transfers. And we were able to, based on that survey process that we did with Barbadians, we were able to determine, well, which state-owned enterprises do we need to keep? We need to keep them functioning. We need to keep the level of transfers where they are. And which state-owned enterprises can we reduce the transfers and have these services delivered in another way? And so in many cases, the cuts that we made were not on the central government wage bill, but on the state-owned enterprises, where, quite frankly, there were lots of inefficiencies. We were able to clean up, I would say, not just on the actual size of the transfers, but on the governance, on the financial reporting, on the fact that under the fund program, SOEs needed to report within 5 days of the end of the month, so that we could see quite clearly what their expenditure was on and how how much of it was operational, how much of it was really delivering services. And so, I think that we had a bit more flexibility there. The debt restructuring that we chose to do, again, it was bold because, most fund programs, you cut in the social sectors, you cut on the wage bill. And traditionally you cut on the social sectors because I think traditionally we have not understood that these social investment is just that, it's investment. And people have, the funding institutions like it in the past have seen it almost as giveaways. Well, these are nice things that we are doing for people, rather than real investment in people's capacity to work and produce and to keep the economy going and to keep the country running. And so we changed that narrative quite a bit with the Burke Plan. And because we were able to make that case by showing we could have these levels of social investment at the same time as we can cut the wage bill in a marginal way, cut transfers in a big way, and raise revenue not just on Barbadians but on people outside the country, that helped make the case.
Alexander, it's Peggy here. I wonder if I could just make a quick comment on that before you go to your next question.
Yes,
May I do that? Because it's really important. I really want to thank Minister Caddle because, and I won't go into a fulsome thank you that I feel because of time. I just want to say that in the last module, last week, we saw in detail what the old IMF plan, structural adjustment plan looks like, because we saw what happened in Jamaica and in St. Vincent.
Mm-hmm.
And for a long time, people like myself, feminists like myself, have been saying that the first thing that happens with structural adjustment, the most characteristic thing, as the minister says, is cutting jobs. And those jobs are always cuts in social services and in subsidies to the poor. That is what happened in Jamaica, in St. Vincent, everywhere else. So the fact that Barbados was able not only to protect those services, health and education specifically, but also to see them as a form of social investment that reinforces the base for economic growth, that's huge. So I just wanted to underline that. I used to say, when you cut social services, women are jeopardized in three ways. First of all, when you cut social services, you're cutting jobs in which women predominate. Secondly, you're cutting services which are essential for social reproduction. Those services that are really, as you say, Minister, you can't, your labor force is not a very productive labor force if it's neither educated nor healthy. And the third thing is that then women have to fill those gaps. So
yes.
I'm really very, very impressed with that. And I just wanted to underline that for the course, to link what you've said as an actual practice right now to what we have already discussed in the module first on gender, because there we looked at social reproduction and how important social reproduction is. And then secondly, in the module last week, when we saw the actual effect of structural adjustment in the 80s, where the cuts in social services were very evident. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peggy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peggy, for reinforcing that important point, that when the traditional programs disproportionately affect women because they normally have to fill the breach. I wanted to probe a bit on that. You said you consulted with the population as you developed this plan, which I think is a really fascinating reversal of the traditional steps. But I wanted to ask, did you consult specifically with CSOs or women organizations as you wrote the plan? And as well, was there any sort of gendered analysis, understanding that while you ring-fenced healthcare and education, you still had to cut and retrench 1,000 jobs. So I was wondering what the gender distribution of employment in the state-owned enterprises is, and if there was some sort of gender analysis of what the actual impact would be on women, as you had to cut something.
Yes. Right. So the work plan was written in the context of the social partnership discussion. So the first meeting that we had as coming to service as a government was with the social partnership. And we did that because, you know, the reason that this plan is working is all about solidarity. That's the truth. I think that in cases where a government tries to execute something this transformational on its own, it doesn't have very high chances of success. So we met the social partnership within days of coming to service, and we presented our ideas for some of the basic things that we needed. We needed to do. Obviously, some of the things that we were proposing were really going to hit capital hard, and the private sector, talked through with us every point of the plan.
I'm really sorry to interrupt. I'm really sorry,
fine.
but could you just, for some of us who don't know exactly what the social partnership is?
I'm sorry. Yes.
No problem.
So Barbados has a tripartite governance model that we call the social partnership, that is made up of government, the private sector, and labor, represented by trade unions. And for most major decisions, we consult the social partnership. Now, the truth is that governance model weakened in the previous decade, and we think that the reason that we saw some of the economic and social fallout that we did was because that governance model weakened. Because the truth is that if you're finding as a government that you are challenged in the provision of services and goods to people, then you need to call on your partners to discuss, to pick up the slack, to see what can be done. I think that the previous government did not really make much reference to the social partnership. And so a lot of kind of discord was allowed to fester, and that didn't help the economic and the social situation. So this is the way traditionally Barbados has chosen to govern, bringing workers fully into the conversation, not just as workers but as people, and so the Burt plan was endorsed by the social partnership before we went back to the country with our proposal for anything that we were trying to do. Now, one of the things that we realized about the social partnership, though, is that it is really about political organization, because every entity represented there, government, the private sector, and labor, are highly organized entities, and all with constituents, right? So politically represent their constituents, and so sometimes the conversation is very heavily focused on kind of economics and production, and even with labor there. And so we established a social justice committee, which is a committee of CSOs, women's groups, really every, represented almost by every group that you can think of in Barbadian society. And while we were not able to mobilize the social justice committee in time to sign off at the same time on the Burt plan, the Social Justice Committee also meets regularly as part of our governance model to be able to respond to draft legislation, proposals that will eventually come to cabinet, and so on. So the Social Justice Committee is an attempt to expand the social partnership so that we are not just talking about kind of the main interests of labor and capital, but we're talking about really what are the social justice concerns of Barbadians. And we are using that model to try and affect major decisions, and also to affect and to inform how we continue to roll out the work plan. The second part of your question had to do with gender analysis in looking at the adjustment. Now, I would say yes. I would say that gender and social justice analysis was a part of everything that we've done. When we had to look at the categories of work that would be retrenched, we had to look at gender, because there is this kind of gender segregation of labor in the public service, right? So if you decide that your general worker category is one that is not really needed, then it's mostly men that are affected. If you decide that your clerk typist category is one that is not really needed, then it's mostly women that are affected. And those are two categories that, in moving towards efficiency, so moving away from paper, moving away, for example, from driving files from one ministry to another, which was a big part of our transformation. A lot of the ways that we were able to make efficient savings had to do with modernizing how government works. So, for example, I, as a minister, I write a lot of correspondence myself, or you have like an app where you can speak into the phone and it writes the thing for you, and then you just sign it. And that in that way, you don't need somebody to type a letter, and you can kind of help upskill that category of workers so that they can move to more productive, more perhaps a higher income earning area of work. So a lot of what we did in terms of looking at the categories of work that we perhaps would not need for the future, we looked at categories where these were functions that perhaps were not as necessary as they used to be. And it's amazing. We found some functions that were established when Barbados worked a lot differently. When you had even equipment or the way that geographically the country was organized that necessitated certain kinds of work. We're talking about going back over 50 years, over 100 years in some cases. And so when we did the analysis to look at the categories of worker that we would be separating from the public service, we were able to see how many women and how many men were affected. And we made a decision that, and this sounds strange to say, but that we would not want to have it skewed in either direction. And so in fact, fewer women than men were retrenched as a part of this process, acknowledging that women's income really tends to have to do more. Obviously, we didn't know the individuals, and so we couldn't say for sure what the dependency ratios in those households were. But we tried really to not have women be more affected than men in that process. The other thing that we tried to do was, where we knew that we were kind of re-engineering some of the functions to be able to bring people back on, we also looked at making sure that we created functions that men and women could benefit from equally, so that as we move to re-engineer into more highly skilled categories of work, we wanted to make sure that these were areas that women and men would equally as easily be able to transition into. So that was also part of our discussion and part of our analysis. Another thing that we did was we created something called a household mitigation unit that is in the Prime Minister's office. The household mitigation unit had a list of every person who was separated from the public service, made contact with those people, got a sense of their family size and structure, and tried to work with them to be able to address short-term needs, so short-term transfers that needed to be made through the social protection system, but also medium and long-term needs for employment, even if it's employment in the private sector and so on. And so that unit is still working every day with those families to make sure that they kind of mitigate the fallout.
Wow, that was great. And I'm going to be very honest, compared to our presentation last week, which I think was a very realistic one, as Peggy said, about what traditionally happens in these programs. This program that you're doing really sounds almost from a different planet. It's great to hear that you did that gender analysis of who will be retrenched, but also considered in the upskilling, ensuring that the upskilling opportunities were equally available to men and women. And I think this household mitigation unit is also quite a novel idea because, as Peggy said earlier, when these things traditionally happen, it disproportionately, the weight on filling the breach disproportionately falls on women. So I wanted to ask, you're 2 years into this plan. When do you anticipate kind of moving out of the transformation phase? And what plans do you have to ensure that the investment in healthcare, education, in these essential services continues and grows moving into the future?
I think that we've already begun the transformation. I think you wanted to ask, when do I think we'll move into the transformation phase?
Yes, when do you think you'll move into the transition phase?
Yeah. I think we've already started, to be honest. I mean, that sounds a bit trite, perhaps, sorry, but I do think that from the beginning, we started with transformation in mind. So there's quite a lot to say. We have been, this parliament has been the busiest, I would say, in terms of legislative reform of any post-independence government. So, one of the things I always say, and the Prime Minister says this a lot, is that government has more tools at its disposal than tax and spend, right? We also are lawmakers, and we also have regulatory and legislative reform that we have at our disposal to make people's lives better. So a lot of the things that we're doing have already been transformational, not necessarily all within the work plan, but some of them are. And so we are introducing measures, for example, like minimum wage legislation. We're introducing paternity leave legislation, and so many other areas, from those that affect the household economy to those that affect traditional productive sectors like renewable energy, like medicinal cannabis. We are really working hard on completely changing the landscape of governance and for growth and transformation in Barbados. So I would say that we're already in that phase. I would say, though, that it won't, even though the EFF, the Extended Fund Facility from the fund, is a 4-year program, the transformation, excuse me, is going to take quite a bit longer, I think. I think that we are trying to structure it such that we see some short-term, medium-term, and long-term benefits. And we're doing this in a very practical way. So, for example, when it comes to the agriculture sector, we have even tried to make sure that we reintroduce these short-term crops, right? Like things that take 6 weeks and 8 weeks to grow and to be able to give income. So we introduced this farmer enfranchisement and empowerment drive where we are making land and other agricultural technology available. So, for example, the retrofitted trailers, that if you don't have access to land, that you can kind of do this in urban areas. We're making that available to people, but we're also supporting in the kind of production that gives them regular access to income. So if you have things like okras and tomatoes and string beans that for some reason had disappeared from the landscape, but that we're trying to strengthen production in, not just as a food security issue, but to be able to give people regular access to income. At the same time, we're doing a lot of work on the climate crisis and climate resilience side, because a lot of what happened in the agriculture sector and a lot of the declines that we saw in yields have to do with the climate crisis, and also have to do with the fact that farmers find it difficult to get insurance. And so all of that to say, Alexander, that it's not just the revenue and expenditure measures that you'll find in the BERT plan that give us the power to be transformational. We are doing a wide range of legislative reforms across every sector that you can think of, from public financial management to energy to labor, that we think really provide the platform for this transformation to take place.
Wow, that's great. I mean, it's great to hear about the reforms in terms of your labor markets and the how much people are paid, but also these agricultural reforms to increase food security, economic resilience, and climate resilience. I just wanted to come back just with two more questions about the challenges.
Mm-hmm.
You gave us a very detailed idea of what kind of gender lens was applied to the budget, which I think is novel, exciting, and necessary. But my understanding is that you have some experience applying this as a technocrat in other countries. Now you're applying it as a technocrat, but also politician, which means you must have some sort of pushback within your ministries, but also from the general population. So I wanted to ask, what is a contrast between working as a technocrat in other countries and now having to apply this in your own country as a politician? What kind of pushback and challenges did you experience with gender budgeting?
Well, this is going to sound unreal as a response. Pushback with applying gender analysis to the work that we did on the budget and on the BERT plan. Internally, I would say there was none. And I'll tell you why. I think that the Prime Minister, and it doesn't matter who is at the table, right? But I think that the Prime Minister came to this with 30 years of experience and understanding about how economic policy affects people as a politician, right? So while I was coming in to this with 20 years experience as an economist, the fact that if I had come as an economist to say to politicians, well, or to say to the political class, we should try this because I think it will work. Technically, I may have gotten, some of that pushback. But because as an economic team, and the BERT plan was written by a team of us who had started this work a few years ago. Because as an economic team led by the Prime Minister, she was able to say, listen, we've lived the experience of not doing things in this way. We've seen how it affects families. We've seen how it affects women and men in different ways. And the argument that we brought for these measures was fully an economic and social well-being argument that did not really get any pushback, because I think, and this is something that Peggy and Roberta and those of us who've done this work have said all the time, that gender analysis doesn't only allow you to see how women are disproportionately affected, but also how men are. And so you can see where you need to make differential investments in the two groups. But I think as long as you make that very transparent, that it is about differential investments in the two groups, as long as you make that transparent to your colleagues who are on the ground, then the argument is made. So I wouldn't say that there was pushback in terms of applying that gender analysis and what the outcome was. I think that I will say, though, that it is a conversation that has to continue, because I think one of the things that people miss is that this approach has to be done with every policy all the time. There's no place really where gender and equity analysis are not relevant. And sometimes that's perhaps what people don't understand, that whether it's agriculture or renewable energy or social protection, wherever it is, you need to bring that to every policy. And that's why the Social Justice Committee is so important, to be able to keep having that conversation on every policy and not just on your economic adjustment. But of course, there will be pushback among the public on certain measures. So we increased revenue. We introduced some user fees. We introduced user fees in the health sector and in the water and sanitation sector. What we did in introducing those was, so for example, the garbage and sewage contribution, that is a user fee for sewage. We also introduced a kind of a relief mechanism where if you find that, you're not able to afford this, then there is, there's a way that you can have it supported by the state. So that's one kind of way we try to mitigate that. But there was pushback on that. There was pushback on, you will have people who are, who don't want to see a fall in their disposable income. I think that's natural, especially because the previous decade had been so difficult for them. But I think the argument that's made is that, right now we have to improve our sewage systems, right? So we have, I think, less than 15% of the population actually hooked up to the sewage systems. Most of them have this kind of individual on-site well on their households, and that is a real challenge for us in terms of the runoff of nitrates and so on into the water courses and then eventually to the coast. And that is a big part of our challenge with respect to the kind of degradation, environmental degradation that we're seeing. So the garbage and sewage contribution, for example, is with a view to being able to improve at a national level the environment for all people. It's not an easy sell, but it's the truth. And so we've tried to communicate the purpose and the rationale behind every measure that we've introduced. But to be frank, we've also seen a lot of we've also made adjustments on the other side. I spoke earlier about the income tax and the fact that people are actually paying less income tax, and they're getting on average a 5% increase in their income because of the changes that we've made in income tax. So yeah, of course we've gotten the resistance to some of the measures. I would say on the one hand, we've tried to very clearly explain why this is necessary, why we chose this entry point for being able to increase revenue. But we've also been able to show where we've been investing more in people and their families and their households. And I think since we've done that we've for the most part had the buy-in and the solidarity of most Barbadian people.
Wow, I really like that point about not sugarcoating the reality and the need for truth and a rationale behind everything. I think your sewage example is an excellent one in that things have to change in some cases.
Yes.
That runoff really is jeopardizing your coastal zone and jeopardizing tourism and jeopardizing the long-term sustainability of the economy. As this course is about society and economy, I just wanted to end by circling back to this social partnership and ask do you think that this social partnership structure where it's tripartite and you have a significant civil society contribution to the discussions, do you think that that was an important factor in this idea of breaking out of the cycle? And I just wanted you maybe just to come back to the cycle, the idea that, before we were spending too much and spending unwisely, which gets us into debt, which when it gets us into debt, it forces us to go to the IMF or someone else, who then force us to cut back spending on everything, which then reduces our investment in the very things that get us out of debt, education and our very healthcare.
Yes.
Which means that when we do eventually get out of debt because of those cutbacks, we don't have the ability to actually earn money to stay out of debt. Traditional agreements would maybe disproportionately speak to the private sector, and the private sector would be the one receiving most of the cuts, and then you would be taxing the broad population base. So do you think that social partnership structure and the civil society contribution, how important was that to you to structuring the plan and kind of this idea of breaking out of the cycle?
I think that it was, I don't think we could have gotten the plan to where we are without that approach. Because the truth is that at a very granular level, we needed to have the input of the private sector as well. So for example, we had a differential rate of VAT on the tourism sector, and we wanted to equalize the VAT. And what they said to us was, well, we would prefer this level of increase on the VAT, and then you introduce a levy for us because we think that we can manage that better. So that's one of the ways in which, actually the actual nuts and bolts of the plan benefited from the social partnership. And then, of course, Labour being able to say, well, we think that in order for us to really look at efficiency in work, looking at productivity of labor and so on, to see what changes should be made, then the unions were able to have that conversation with us. And similarly, some of the other groups that represented women, and so on. I will say that, as I said earlier, we did not bring the Social Justice Committee in from the beginning on the discussion, but what we were able to do, because we took the discussion to the Barbadian public right away, was that we were able to get all kinds of feedback on what we were proposing and all kinds of ideas for its implementation. We continue to get that. We continue to have regular meetings of the social partnership. The BERT is a moving thing. And while we describe it as a medium-term strategy, it is something that is live and is changing all the time. The conversation about social investment, it's never a hard conversation to have with unions or with other CSOs, but we had to make the conversation very clear with the private sector, I feel, who understand that education is important and want to have an educated labor force, but do not always from the very beginning see the connection between government investment in education and the educated labor force that they have. So we were able to have that conversation very clearly from the very beginning to say, listen, help us understand the kind of skills that the private sector needs, because we are willing to make the investment, but your role is to help us now kind of parse that and make sure that it's relevant skills that we're developing, and also partner with us on development of those skills. We have two programs that are major social investment programs for us in the area of education and skills. One of them is called Job Start Plus, where we're partnering with the private sector to allow every young person a year to work for at least a year. The reason we came up with this program is that when we were on the ground, I'll be honest with you, for me as an MP on the ground in an urban constituency, one of the things that I realized was that we had this entire generation of young people who had never worked. So they came out of school and came of age in a depressed economy, no access to jobs, and then they didn't work. They never worked. They've just, for 7 years, they didn't work. And so they were fully marginalized from the labor market and all markets. I mean, in some cases, we're talking about people who never had an identification card, a passport, just completely marginalized. And so when we came in, we said, listen, we have to make sure that we have a pathway by which people at least get a first job. So, sorry, I'm getting some feedback there. Okay, that's better. So at least get a first job. And we call it the First Jobs Program, and we since changed the name to Job Start Plus. And the private sector is partnering with us on that because those jobs are largely in the private sector. So that's one that we were able to agree to as a part of the social partnership. And the second one is a national training initiative where we're investing at least 10 million a year on really broad-based upskilling of almost every category of work. That sounds absurd when you say it like that, but it's necessary because what we find is that if we really want to target efficiency and productivity across sectors, we need to go back to the basics of, how people are able to do their best work. And so we have this national training initiative, which is, it is about reaching everyone. And we have a protocol for car washers, we have a protocol for doctors, and we're engaging every category of worker over 4 years to be able to provide skills. And we also came up with that as a part of the social partnership. So absolutely, I think it was necessary to have that conversation there to understand that even when you're in an adjustment, investing in health and education are the things that are going to give you a more long-term growth trajectory. And they absolutely became a part of that plan.
Great. Thank you so much for ending with that. It's always, heartening, especially in the context of this course, to know that without civil society kind of keeping you in check and checking up on you, making sure that you're responsible, for investing in people, that kind of makes the plan more robust.
Mm-hmm.
So really a great message for the activists and everyone else on the course. So I think now it's time for us to turn it over to the course participants. Of course, last week we had a very critical view of the structural adjustment programs. So I'm sure that they will have some difficult and probing questions for you, because we know that it's not all roses and, nice things with these kind of plans. So if anyone would like to speak, please just send us a message or unmute your mic. Now is the time to ask questions.